This is October 22nd, 2022, and this is the Folks Lead group meeting with Isabel Frey, which is very exciting all around. And we'll turn it over to you to kick things off.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for having me and for being flexible with the timing. And I'm really happy that this is finally happening. And I'm a bit nervous because it's always like, yeah, I don't know, especially since I've been researching very close to you in the sense that I've interviewed a couple of you already, and I'm dealing with a lot of, I'm trying to kind of, I guess, grasp what has been going on with Yiddish Folksong, unaccompanied Yiddish song, from kind of this perspective of being part of it, but trying to kind of document also what is happening right now. So I have a presentation, and it's basically a version. It's kind of a sketch of some of the things that I've been working on that I'm trying to turn into my first draft of the chapter, which is it's a bit since I'm still very much in the process of just kind of collecting and doing interviews with people right now. I've been interviewing a lot of also young singers, students of Ethel, like Eleanor Weil and Anthony Russell and people like so I've just been still very much in the process of kind of talking to a lot of people, but I'm going to present some basically open thoughts and some theoretical material that I've been working through, and I would be very interested to basically also just hear your thoughts on it, your resonance, or what resonates, what doesn't, just on that level. So I'm going to start I'm first going to start the presentation, and then I think I can start that first. No, I first need to start the share screen. Okay. Yes, this is possible. So, okay, can everyone see it?
Yep.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay. So I gave the chapter or the talk the title "Listening in Yiddish," because it's really about this question of the way in which singers and Yiddish song teachers and Yiddish song students and singers engage with field recordings, and also kind of learn to listen to these field recordings. And I've basically been thinking about what does it mean to, well, I will come to that, but what does it basically mean to listen natively to a recording or to a song tradition? Like, what does it, what kind of an ear does it need for it? And what is there such a thing as listening in a language, as one would say, speaking in a language? And so I've kind of started, starting out with this assumption of this golden age that is happening right now with Yiddish folk song resources that are so rich everywhere, and also just available online, and how, as far as I understand, it's really just something from the past decade, basically, because before that the availability of certain, and there was the availability of certain records, but not so much this online distribution. And it's also something that is on the inside the Yiddish Folksong website, which you of course write, we're at an historic moment for two reasons. And so on one hand, because of the amount of Yiddish Folksong recordings, and on the other hand, the interest. So the interest of singers to study this tradition. So that's a bit kind of the phenomenon that I'm trying to describe as a whole in my PhD research, which I should say it's basically in ethnomusicology. I'm at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Vienna, and it's I'm primarily working in the ethnomusicology department, but it is an interdisciplinary program. And I'm also trying to engage a lot with kind of Jewish studies, Yiddish studies, literature. And And so some of the terms that I've been, thinking with, or that people are thinking with, that I've talked to a lot of you also about these terms already, is on one hand this term kind of revival that is so much like also rejected by a lot of people from within the Yiddish culture movement. The much wider used revitalization, but still kind of the assumption of something is kind of is like made anew or revitalized. The prefix re, as Mark Slovin also wrote about. And on the other hand, this idea of continuity, so of a kind of an unbroken tradition of Yiddish song, and there's this polarity going on. And so I've been trying to think about how to escape this polarity with terms, but it's been difficult because one of the terms that I've engaged with when thinking about kind of these questions of continuity and rupture is a term from an essay by Walter Benjamin from 1921, which from his essay "The Task of the Translator," and in English translated, it's called afterlife, which in English just kind of sounds like another way of saying revival in a way. But in German, it's a bit different in the original language because it's more about like a Nachleben. So it's more kind of like a post life or a Fortleben, which is like a further life. Yeah, so I've put these terms in there as well. Then there's the question kind of transmission, and whether this is a kind of a transmission process that has been going on, or is it more useful to think of it as a transposition, that there's something being shifted also. And then there's also the whole terminology question about the song tradition itself. So are we talking about Yiddish folk song, Yiddish unaccompanied song, Yiddish traditional song, vernacular song, or are we talking about singing rather than song? I mean, where are the boundaries between the style, the genre, the repertoire, and how to also the terminology is very tricky, I think. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cough, so I need to drink some water once in a while. So why did I get to this question of listening? There were actually two paths that got me there. The one thing was the kind of personal experience as a singer and as a singing student. It actually started with I started taking basically my first Yiddish song lessons with Benji Fox-Rosen in Vienna, and the first lesson he was like, "Oh, have you ever listened to recordings of Yiddish native speakers singing?" And I was like, "No, I haven't." And he was like, "Oh, you should go listen to these recordings," and showed me the Ruth Rubin record, and later on told me that, I mean, he'd also been kind of introduced to this, and this opened a new world for him as it did for me. So it was really encountering this I guess pedagogy that relies heavily also on listening in order to learn to sing. And it was also the personal experience of having to learn how to listen. So first hearing field recordings of traditional singers and not really knowing so much what to do with it. And that's also a bit what I've kind of I know that other singers that I've spoken to also felt that way. So I've kind of also tried to zoom in through the interviews to that. So I'll come to that still. The other question was that I was focusing initially on this question of voice and trying to understand more the role of the voice and of the timbre specifically in Yiddish folk song and in this style. And I quickly discovered that it's kind of impossible to study voice and timbre without looking at it through listening. So, sorry, one second. It's in a lot of voice studies literature, the question of timbre is always a question of listening, of who listens and who recognizes what voice as belonging to whom, basically. And then it's basically through listening that the identity of who is speaking is created. So this is following a lot the research of Nina Eitzheim, who's a voice studies scholar at UCLA, a musicologist. And she says basically voice's source is not the singer, but it's the listener. So one of my main research questions for this part of my research is, yes?
Could you just repeat that sentence, voices something, but not the listener? Yeah, I missed a word there.
So did you see it? Voice's source, voice's source is not the singer, it is the listener.
Okay, thank you.
Eitzheim has created a whole new body of work around this. The way analyzing how people listen to singers and decide who those singers really are. And that has a lot to do with timbre, and it can cross gender and race in various kinds of ways. It's really very provocative work about the issue of how listeners create, in a sense, something that the singer has perhaps not even wanted to do, or how the singer resists the typologization that they know the listener is going to be producing. It's really
it's maybe good so this is basically a quote from her book. It's her second book called The Race of Sound, and it's building on her earlier work, which critiques the idea of sound. I mean, also just kind of sound as a metaphor that we kind of use to clump together all these different acoustic phenomena. And specifically, when we're talking about the voice and we speak about the sound of the voice, we mean timbre, and often we mean everything that cannot be captured by any other parameters. And those are often very much gendered and racialized. Or I mean, according to her, they're always, situated on some kind of racialized and gendered in some way. And she's looking specifically at African-American music and and those questions of timbre in that sense, but it's really also more like a general theory. And I think what is interesting, what she does is she just shifts the focus so much to questions of listening. And she's not the only one who's been doing that. I mean, it's every time trying to find out more about timbre, it really is hard to detach it. Yeah, is that clear? Does that answer your question, Josh?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So basically, I've been trying to find like how do contemporary Yiddish singers learn to listen to field recordings of Yiddish folk songs. So I've specifically trying to focus on the learning from field recordings. I mean, we can also still talk about that, also what the difference is, but I think it's also so interesting the position that field recordings have within Yiddish song pedagogy, basically. And I'm less interested in the why, I guess, because I think the why, I mean, it's first of all very subjective, and it might just be answered by saying, okay, in order to learn how to sing, or because someone told them so or something, but more about the ways in which it's done, and also the way in which it works, this learning to listen, like what is actually happening there. And there are different ways to conceptualize that. And so I first want to point to this distinction also between listening and hearing that is very important when we're talking about listening, because it is actually often conflated, especially in kind of in these very grand gestures of distinguishing auditory perception from like visual perception, for example. It's often kind of just assume that it's the part of the same thing in a way. And I think it's useful, the definition of Jonathan Stern, who is a media sound and media studies scholar, and he wrote a wonderful book on kind of the emergence of modern forms of directed listening. I'll still talk about that, but he basically already distinguishes listening as a directed learned activity. So I quote now, listening is a directed learned activity. It is a definite cultural practice. Listening requires hearing, but is not simply reducible to hearing. And I would say that's kind of the also a definition that we would probably also all share. It's kind of like a common sense definition of saying, okay, well, hearing is part of listening, but it's not the same thing. It cannot be reduced to it because there's something more to listening, which is more directed or more purposeful or more also like learned and cultural. Also important to realize though that it's like any other kind of dichotomy. It's very much a construct in the way that it revolves around a kind of binary assumption of, for example, the natural and the cultural, or to be attentive or distracted. So it also needs to be kind of treated with care, I think. But it's important if we're talking about learning to listen that we're talking about a learned activity and a practice. I really wanted to engage also with this question of ethno-hearing because it was actually Walter Feldman who pointed me to it via email, and I've also read about it. I think on the inside the Yiddish Folksong website, it also mentions this question of ethno-hearing in relation to intonatsia. And so it's this concept by Isabel Zemtovsky, and I'm sure maybe you've talked about it, but so. Quote, an indispensable, inherited, and possibly even natural musical attribute. And I think I have some issues with ethno-hearing as a concept to work with conceptually, and I just wanted to mention that what I think the problem with it is in relation to this question of listening to to recordings. On one hand, there's of course kind of the question of the ethnos and the boundaries of the ethnos. So despite the fact that, of course, there are different kind of culturalized ways of hearing that, but it's very hard to, draw boundaries of like different ethno hearings, I would say, because it's hard to draw boundaries of an ethnos, and especially if we're talking about Yiddish, Jewish Ashkenazi. I mean, I think it gets more complicated than even with other ethnoses. But I mean, that's a whole another question. Then a kind of a romantic nationalist assumption of that there are so many, that there is this way of hearing that is very much tied to one's group belonging. And then possibly also a conflation of hearing and listening. I mean, I feel like, because how much of it, if we say that listening is learned, how much of the ethno-hearing is also learned? Like, wouldn't it then make more sense to call it ethno-listening? So I'm also struggling with that a bit and thinking about different ways of conceptualizing it. So other ideas of mine were something like insider listening or native listening, which I will come to, which comes from Chandler also, or this post-vernacular listening. So this brings us to this question of post-vernacular listening. And it's funny because it's basically Jeffrey Chandler in Adventures in Yiddish Land opens the acknowledgement sections with the sentence, "I am a native listener of Yiddish." And I think that's a very interesting way to put it. And it's probably a lot of you also who consider yourselves native listeners, rather than native speakers, or part native, what is the boundary? And there's certainly something that is different from being a native listener and being a native speaker. And then we're also living in a time, or we're dealing with a phenomenon right now where a lot of the also Yiddish singers, younger singers in the transnational Yiddish culture scene are not native listeners, and maybe have not even heard any Yiddish around them growing up, maybe some commercial records, but not necessarily spoken Yiddish. So again, then a quote from Chandler's book, which I think really helps in thinking through this, is, quote, "Singing, reciting, lecturing, or even conversing in Yiddish is no longer something one simply does, as presumably had once been the case. Rather, it is something one elects and arranges to do. One rehearses, studies, and appreciates. Yiddish speech has been professionalized, aestheticized, academized, and ritualized," end quote. And I think that's interesting because, I mean, he's counting singing, reciting, lecturing, and we can also add maybe listening in Yiddish, or listening to Yiddish folk song recordings, and listening in Yiddish as just kind of listening to someone speaking Yiddish or singing in Yiddish is no longer one simply does, as presumably once had been the case. So that's a question we can ask. But it's a choice, and it's something that needs to be studied. And through that, I think the central term that is in this quote is also aestheticized, that it becomes kind of it gets an extra aesthetic. So through this, the really this detailed listening to a recording is a different way of learning a song than face to face, when someone is just, you learn a song from someone singing it more often. So it gets an extra kind of aesthetic quality to it that is a kind of surplus. So I think that's what I find interesting about Chandler's framework about post-vernacularity, that fits into what I've been thinking about, and in this question of learning to listen. Now I want to come to this idea also that with listening and with learning to listen, it's not just about understanding the recording and the song and the style or the sound world, but it's also about understanding the value of the recording, of the style, of the way it's performed, but also the context. And there's a kind of appreciation also in the process of learning to listen. There's also a change in appreciation. And I'm going to show you the quote that made me really think of that. It's was one of my first interviews with my good friend and colleague Esther Wratschko, who I also work with a lot in Vienna, and she also studied for many years at Yiddish Summer Weimar, and also with a lot of people of you. And I asked her a lot about this first encounter, also specifically with Yiddish folk song recordings. And so this is a quote by her. "At first, I thought, why do we listen to these people that can't properly sing? It was really quite strange at first, these old archival recordings. You have these people that teach and play these recordings for you very slowly and detailed from old people that can sometimes barely hold their voice. If you're not familiar with it, it sounds peculiar. But during the week, when you get the explanations and your ear is trained what to listen for, these small ornaments, these small slides, the moment your hearing is trained for this, you notice the richness of the ornamentation and expression. Over the years, I learned more and more and quickly understood what this is about and what a big treasure it is to have these recordings and to be able to learn from them." So yeah, I think this is, it's a quote. Of course, it's not like Esther would never say something like that today. It's kind of, she's narrating her first encounter, and there's this change in not understanding and also not being able to value the way in which it's sung. And then through developing the ear, you notice the richness of the ornamentation. So it's these metaphors of richness that appear a lot. I mean, also just in the way I talk about Yiddish song a lot also, and try to tell people, the value also of traditional style. So it's really points to the fact that there's a lot of there's also a struggle for value going on that I'm trying to describe a bit in a way, and trying to understand what it is about. And the way in which the ability to hear also creates the sense of value. And it's really just, you need to be able to hear and understand in order to appreciate its value if you didn't grow up with the tradition. So this is all in a post-vernacular setting, I would say. So I've been trying to find also a bit like how to think about this valuing, because it's difficult. A lot of, if I look for theory on valuing and culture, it's a lot about economic valuing, but we're not talking obviously about economic value. It's in a very recent journal article in the journal Ethnomusicology. There's Deont L. Harris, who writes from this value from below, and he's writing kind of about this question of why do people, engage with musics they love, and especially marginalized people in his case, they don't get anything from it. And so in his case, he's talking about the article is about kind of UK carnival scene and like Black Caribbean British participation in the carnival scene. And so this is a quote from the article: "For those upon whom racism is exercised as a means to devalue, degrade, and or destroy, the margins and marginality often become illustrative of value from below in ways that break away from restrictive imaginings of what it is and what could be," end quote. Yeah, I'm still not sure how much I can put, these questions into dialogue with this phenomenon, also because of the question between kind of racism against Black Caribbeans in the UK, obviously very different phenomenon, and this question of kind of marginality and Jewish culture and Yiddish culture is one that is just very geographically specific, and is surely very different in my context in Vienna and Austria than it is in New York City, than it is again in Texas, basically. But what I find interesting, I mean, there obviously has been this long history also of devaluing Yiddish culture through centuries of anti-Semitism. And there is also a racialization aspect that still continues in a kind of dismissal of Yiddish culture as a whole. So I think that's more the second question of is what we're valuing here also just kind of Yiddish as a whole, and trying to kind of protect it against the way it's been devalued also historically as a jargon, or as a dialect of German, or as a weakened diasporic culture. So all these different degradations of Yiddish. And at the same time, and maybe what is going on much more is just the valuing of the field recordings as a source, valuing folk singers and traditional style against a kind of devaluation of any kind of like non-professional music, or the hegemony of kind of a Western classical musical aesthetics. Like, how much is this, specific from within a history of Yiddish culture, and how much is it just a question of kind of a folk tradition? And on the other hand, I mean, I do think that a lot of other folk traditions that do have a kind of nation state behind them that is actively in a way appropriating also or promoting it. There's definitely a different status, or a different value status that is there. So, but these are questions I definitely want to discuss them with you. I want to go a bit also into detail on this question of learning to listen and what is actually happening there. And there I have a quote by Sveta Kundish, also from an interview with her, which I also found fascinating. And it's actually about the first time she at Yiddish Summer Weimar heard the recording. I'm pretty sure it's Michael's recording of Bronya Sakina singing Papier ist sich weiß. And I thought it was really fascinating how she described it. So she said, I quote, "I remember I was listening to it and thinking to myself, I have no idea what is going on. I cannot follow the melody. I cannot follow the rhythms. I'm swimming in the water and I cannot hold on to anything. I just cannot understand how this music works. It's just outside of what I know." And I thought metaphor of swimming in the water and not being able to hold on to anything is really fitting to describe this process of learning to listen, because it's really a question of what in sound studies has been distinguished as kind of listening for rather than listening to. So you need to know what to listen for. You cannot just purely listen and let I mean, it's possible, but then you are confused because you don't really know what to reference it to. So I think it also points to the fact that it's really about knowledge and knowing what to listen for. Yeah, so it's on one hand also just about acquiring the ability to hear, so getting this kind of sharpness in your ear. That's what another interview partner of mine said. It was a sharpness of the hearing. And then there's this other idea of kind of learning to listen as the same way as learning a language, which relates a lot to this idea in ethnomusicology by Mantle Hood, actually, of bimusicality. So the same way we talk about bilingualism. And I do think it's interesting how often I've encountered it also already a lot, this metaphor of learning a language. Learning a style is like learning a language, and also learning to listen is like learning to listen I mean, also when we don't know a language, we don't know where a word starts or ends. So that is the same way. But here we're not talking about the language and understanding the text, but understanding the musical parameters and the musical style. Yeah, and so then we get to this distinction of listening for rather than listening to. And that also relates a bit to, I mentioned before, Jonathan Stern, who's this media studies scholar, and who wrote a book called The Audible Past about this concept of modern audible techniques, which he considers basically the emergence in the 18th century of certain listening techniques that weren't there before, because listening, according to him, had a more, I mean, it's hard to say, how did people listen in the 15th century? It's hard, but had something more ephemeral to it and less kind of technical and skilled. And through different ways of thinking, first of all, about the ear and auditory mechanisms, but also through new technologies. And he really looks at the stethoscope, for example, or also the telegraph as ways in which listening as a skill emerged, and also this idea of like very attentive listening with your ears alone. And so this is a lot, and this is also then listening as a skill is something you need to learn, and it's also something that is directed and more directed. And then I found actually the most interesting parallel to what has been going on with Yiddish song. It's really absurd. It's in this article by, his name is Tom Rice, an anthropologist, a sound anthropologist, and he basically did an ethnography of medical students in a hospital learning how to listen with stethoscopes, so medical auscultation. And it's just, it's almost funny reading these quotes in this article from these medical students who are basically saying the same thing as Sveta. They're basically saying, oh, you at first you just listen and you don't know what's going on, and you hear sounds and you don't know what they are, and it's just too much, and there's nothing to hold on to. So it's really from this article, it really points to Rice really points to the fact that listening for is about knowing what to listen for, which is why this if we come back to Yiddish song, it really, this learning to listen is a process of learning and of teaching and of transmitting knowledge of what there is to listen to. So specific ornaments or the pacing or expressive gestures. And this is basically the listening for that I'm trying to describe, is this listening for the musical style. And this does revolve around, first of all, around just different elements, stylistic elements or parameters. so timbre or rhythm or ornamentation and so on, but maybe also just kind of more general, if that is the more general way to think about it, of the intonatia of an overall soundscape aesthetic, or it's hard to describe it, but I think it moves between, you know, these levels of the particular and of the general, of the overall, of commonalities also between Yiddish folk song style and, for example, Yiddish dance or instrumental music or liturgical music. So of an overall kind of Ashkenazi Jewish soundscape. I would like to also engage, with one work. I've told Mark a bit about it, that I'm trying to deal with, you know, think about what to do with these types of theory. It's a book that came out last year by an Canadian Indigenous sound studies scholar, and it's called Hungry Listening. And it's basically a decolonial critique of this very, you know, analytical, structured, and maybe this kind of modern audile technique form of listening that he really saw a lot in kind of he describes it a lot in the encounter of settlers in the New World and indigenous musics and kind of a lot. It's basically, he describes it as, quote, Hungry Listening, quote, prioritizes the capture and certainty of information over the effective feel, timbre, touch, and texture of sound, end quote. So it's really also kind of about this consumptive, getting information from music and not really engaging with it through multiple senses also. So it's really also this multi-sensuality that is assumed to be missing. It's also this critique of kind of isolating sound as a bounded object and hearing as, you know, something we only do with the ears, and maybe we don't feel it or on that level. And
Isabel, the points that are listed here are the things that Robinson is arguing against.
This is the description. Sorry, yes, this is the description this is the description of hungry listening. So the first point, I would say this is what the book is. It's a decolonial critique of analytical listening. The second thing is what he argues against. He argues against hungry listening and against isolating sound. Yes, sorry, I'm not clear with that. And then in the end, or basically what he's arguing for is this idea of a critical listening positionality to reflect one's own listening biases. So he doesn't really, you know, say, it's very clear hungry listening is he's critiquing this form of listening and then saying we should really just be reflecting our positionality from which we're listening and our own biases kind of from this perspective. And also because, you know, he's critiquing a certain type of kind of a way of listening that is very much focused on the ear alone, and also just on a very kind of rational analytical form, and opposing that with the effective feel, touch, and texture of sound. So it's opposing to kind of these affective layers. So this brings me a bit to this kind of binary that that can happen a lot within that I've read a lot about from books like Robinson or also in Nina Eitzheim, but also I've kind of encountered it, you know, thinking about, okay, how do I listen to to field recordings? And there's this kind of binary between a certain type of more analytical way of listening and a more kind of rationalized and a more effective like emotional way of listening. And of course it's a bit problematic to draw this binary, and I'm not, you know, saying that this exists as such, but it's also just something that I feel like is drawn a lot from the literature. But there's certainly also different approaches that possible to take to a field recording, and there are different ways of listening, some that involve more kind of directed attention, and some that involve a more open attention, or some that involve more kind of affect and feeling and connection, and others that involve more kind of a view from above, basically. One that categorizes. And what I've though think, and this is why I have problems with critiques like Robinson with and with knowing what to do, is that with Yiddish, with listening to Yiddish folk songs, it needs all these, it needs types of listening that are on all these in-betweens of this continuum. So it needs it on both sides, and so much also what I mentioned before of this question of valuing, it really depends on this very analytical structural way of listening that maybe gets bad attention from a decolonial perspective. But I think from within the phenomenon that we are in, it's not it's not so easy to say like, oh, we don't need any of that, this is all not good or something like that. It needs all kinds of it needs different modes, and it needs to move between these different modes. So I think that's basically one of my main also kind of normative points that I want to make in response to some of these critiques of this the importance also of this kind of this very analytical listening. And so to the end, I just want to kind of come back to these different examples or different listening situations, and this is really something that I'm trying to collect at the moment, are these different also situations in which people listen to Yiddish field recordings. I'm also just very interested in, who just listens to the Ruth Rubin archive and for what reason and so on, and in what setting. And there are different settings, and they each involve very different modes, modalities, and a connection of different modalities of listening. So for example, listening to a field recording in a one-on-one or in a group Yiddish singing lesson to learn the song in a singer style and to really study this singer style. That is a different form of listening than, for example, listening to a field recording by slowing it down and listening to certain parts over and over again to understand and repeat the ornamentation. That can be part of the first one, but it involves also, again, a different type of attentiveness and more zooming in. It also requires the use of technology to help. Then listening to a whole set of field recordings on a regular basis. Actually multiple people I've spoken to who said that they've just listened to the Ruth Rubin record a lot, all the time, over and over again. And what that does, immersing oneself in a soundscape that doesn't work the same way as does this very directed form of listening. Maybe listening to a field recording that one simply loves for no reason other than for pleasure. It just gives you pleasure and you listen to it. And then what I've also just find very fascinating is this point that when one listens to a field recording that one has heard so often that one can sing along in one's head, and it's what I've also trying to think about a lot is when people sing and while they sing, they hear a recording in their head because they hear the recording that they learned from in their head. Maybe that is very similar to the way people just learn songs from other people and hear the voice of the other person in their head. But maybe there is also this extra mediation, because of course a recording is always a moment frozen in time, and there are certain parts that might just be complete coincidence why someone took a breath at one certain point or made an ornament at that certain point. And then of course also this question of then what does it mean to personalize a Yiddish folk song, and how much of the ornamentation from the interpretation of the original recording is taken over. And and what is changed, and I find it actually maybe perhaps a bit more interesting what is kind of cited and taken over, and how does that kind of reappear in the performance. Yeah, so I'm just going to end with some open questions. I'm very excited to discuss with you. Also, I guess kind of why has the more overarching question is why has listening become so important in the contemporary transmission of Yiddish folk song? And maybe that is also a bit of a rhetoric, or it's kind of clear. I mean, it obviously relates a lot to the conditions of Yiddish culture and Yiddish folk culture today, and ruptures in transmission or different mediations that come in through digital connection. But I would be very interested to hear what you think about that. Then this question of has listening changed in the post-vernacular mode, and how has it changed? If we assume that we are in a post-vernacular mode, which we can also discuss, or maybe not all of us are, but people like me are, the question also, what is the cultural or socio-political significance of teaching and learning to Yiddish folk songs? So perhaps this question of valuing also, like what does it do with regards to Yiddish culture as a whole? What different listening modes and positionalities are there? And to what extent, and this is, I think, one of the more important or set points, are the aesthetics as a whole of Yiddish folk song that we try to kind of describe and transmit, also constructed through listening practices, and how much are they tied to these ways of listening? So when we talk, for example, about different parameters, I mean, we would only be able to understand these parameters when we are able to listen to them. Yeah, and then this point also about how do they transform and revalue or value Yiddish folk songs? How does it become something new? Does it become something else than it used to be? Does it make sense to ask, to assume that it used to be something bounded also? That is another question, of course. Okay, so I'm at the end of my presentation. I will briefly show you my list, and I'm happy to share it also. This were just the works that I mentioned today. And yeah, maybe I'll end the presentation now and we can discuss together. Or are there any immediate questions maybe first?
Well, I just want to thank you first for laying things out so clearly and so articulately, and for bringing Yiddish Folksong into contemporary ethnomusicology, which is
Mark, bring your sound up a bit, please. Settings and volume.
Well,
or just get closer to the mic.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to bring Yiddish music studies into ethnomusicology and its current, and you're citing some really very interesting recent research, which has made ethnomusicology much more relevant to the topic than it used to be. That's important I think that's a very good thing you're doing there, and it was all very clear, and you covered really a lot of different parameters. So let's say, well, sort of, I mean, I had one thing I was thinking about, but let's open the floor and see what if people have immediate responses.
Well, I'll say something. First of all, a magnificent presentation. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's you've done a great deal of work in kind of updating the framework in which we can address Yiddish folk song in the 21st century. So I think what you're doing, what you're doing is extremely important. I just about every 2 or 3 minutes, you hit a point which I've been preaching about for many years. So it's gratifying in that sense, but from a very rigorous framework that you're working from and collecting the contemporary scholarship on these points. Um, I maybe maybe just make one point that I think one of the critical questions about um, your topic, listening to these recordings, the field recordings, is how far the practice spreads beyond
Mhm.
professional singers or those who are
Yeah.
singing specialists who are listening in order to be able to perform in professional or semi-professional contexts. Because I think uh, you know the I have sometimes characterized Yiddish folk song. I'm sure it applies to lots of folk song, but as being a listener's medium rather than a
Mm.
singer's medium. Um, and I guess I would, if I expand on that a little bit, I took that idea from uh, the the interview with Lila Klumpner, which was reproduced in Image Before My Eyes. And
Mhm.
she relates this experience of going with a couple of her girlfriends to a theatrical performance in Warsaw in the 30s. And they came back from the performance, and as she put it, jeder eine hat genascht a bissel. And they reconstructed the song that they'd heard and
Mm.
liked so much in the performance. And that became part of her repertoire and presumably part of the repertoire of her girlfriends as they grew up. And the song, passed along in this very typical way. Um, and I guess the signal point was that brought this home to me was when Barbara Streisand was watching this on an editing machine and just dropped her jaw after hearing this Brooklyn housewife sing, and she asked, "Well, who's that?" So, I mean, it speaks, I think, directly to your question about valuing. Um, and uh, I think for me, the post-vernacular part of what's going on now goes directly to that question of who it is that's
Mm.
listening. Because when I was growing up, people would listen to these recordings and then sing them, and then became part of
Mhm.
their repertoire as non-professional singers.
Mhm.
Okay,
Mhm.
um, just singing in the context of after the meal on Shabbos, or in the car, or the other times when one sang, and
Gosh, what
one's
what recordings are you talking about? Sorry.
Ruth Rubin record. I mean that Isabel referenced as being kind of you
Right.
know great example of this. But yeah, so I think that for me is kind of the critical point is
Mhm.
if it's not just a question of valuing the non-professional singer singing
Mhm.
these songs, but the context in which they're sung. If songs
Yeah.
are transmitted uh, in a way that that they're sung not for an audience, but in life, like, in ordinary contexts. That's that's then we're talking about reconstructing or constructing the for lack of a better term, I would call it the folk instrument, okay, which is the collective the place where songs actually live. Anyway, so,
Yeah.
but
Can I quickly respond?
sure,
Yeah, thank you so much. No, it's such an important point, and I think I keep coming back to that. I keep having to remind myself that this is, something it keeps being a blind spot, but that what is also going on, and I mean, I think this also comes out in Chandra's book, is this professionalization, and who is listening to recordings for what reason also. But I mean, maybe one of the thoughts that I'm also interested in is this change. I mean, it really makes a difference if you're listening to a song in order to learn the song itself, or if you're listening to learn to understand the style, and that, I mean, that comes from a different, that in my eyes comes from a more kind of post vernacular position of and professionalized assumption. And the other big question that, I mean, this is not so much part of this this section, but this whole question of Yiddish song, Yiddish folk song performance context. I mean, I've talked a lot to also and with Josh, you and with Ethel about it, and I think that's also, yeah, that's a great point. Who is listening to it also? Yeah.
Yeah, about the records, in my house, I think the Bickel record was more important. I didn't know anything about the Rubin record till much later, even though we knew songs sort of more or less natively, but there were songs that we didn't know, and so and the way he approached it, became something to listen to also. So that I like what you're saying, Josh, is that it's always been the case that people have listened and picked up and valued and all the kinds of things you're talking about. It's not necessarily just post-vernacular. That even in a vernacular period, some of these same practices were going on.
And also, I mean, I would say that there's always an audience. That audience is not only a paying audience in a hall listening to a concert.
Yeah.
Even when we're singing within our chevre, I mean, friends, family, etc. It's a performative situation in one way or another. There's a similar interaction. So it's a spectrum of that kind of interaction, I would say. But there's always some audience, unless we're singing, even possibly when we're singing, so to speak, to ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
We're also listening.
Absolutely.
Well, that's the first audience, is oneself, and I think that sort of gets to what Barbara didn't understand but posed the question. And it's really interesting. But Isabel, that's fabulous, fabulous work. The whole concept of listening versus hearing. And I think what needs to be expanded upon is, in terms of listening, I love the phrase, the positioning. It's what someone brings to listening, because you bring your whole cultural soundscape. You bring your entire life experience to that listening. And I love the quote from Esther and from Sveta, because I've had that experience with certain musics, and you don't understand the organizing principle. It's like, everything is like the meter, the tonality, the sounds, everything is like just one big confusion. And unless you begin to learn how to anchor within that new realm, that's exactly what you're doing. So I think that is key to understanding, and for those of us who are interested in the transmission and the continuity of these cultural values of this style. I mean, there's so many different words we can put to it. I mean, that's so critical. Understanding that piece is so profound and so fundamental.
Mm.
Thank you a million.
Thank you.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Maybe I'll leap in here. I mean, I definitely want to second what everyone said. I mean, it's just wonderful, to hear how, I mean, this is such a wonderfully lucid and nuanced, not only presentation, but I was going to say, I love listening to the way you think about this, and taking in. And I mean, I made a whole bunch of notes that basically in the order of what you were talking about, which I could go through, or we could talk about it separately too, but maybe I'll launch into it here. And now, I mean, first of all, of course, there's the, we all start where we start. We all come into things where we come into them. And you're of course addressing what is mostly the contemporary situation of listening to field recordings. Of course, that's of course, I mean, mainly a generational difference, is that, between needing, not really having the opportunity to listen to people live, certainly for the most part, East European, certainly pre-World War II, never mind pre-World War I born generations. And that's of course a big difference. And I mean, I'm reminded a little bit of the, when you and I were talking privately, the or interviewing in an interview situation or whatever. I mean, you had said the point where you said, so as I understand it, am I right that like basically the interest in Yiddish unaccompanied song began when Ethel first taught at Weimar in 2011, 2010, and I was like, whoa, let's back up about 40 years, not 100 years, and but yeah, so it's, it's not just from the past decade. It is, of course, in talking about people like yourself and others who've come into it in more recent decades. That's I mean, I loved the point about transmission in contrast to transposition. I think transposition is also a great concept there, that there is both transmission and there's transposition. And the word afterlife always kind of, my hackles go up when I hear that, especially, thinking about like Magda Waligórska's book, Klezmer's Afterlife. I'm like, afterlife, you're like talking to those of us who are, of course, we know, we get the point. But yeah, but interesting what you say about Benjamin, that it's, of course, afterlife has different resonances than Nachleben or Fortleben, Überleben. I mean, those are all different. What voice belongs to whom? That's I'd like to, I'd be interested in talking about this more. I mean, I certainly get where, I think, from what you've said, where Eidsheim is going in terms of African American traditions and experience, that things are certainly racialized and gendered, and that's always the case. I'm not sure if I would agree that the voice source is not the singer. Obviously, a voice source is the singer. Another aspect of source is the listener, right? But once again, I mean, I think this fits in with so much of what you were saying, that a lot of these categories are not, they need to be fuzzy categories and not rigidly defined, in terms of, yes, A and B, and C, and possibly D. Yeah, and that's, gets onto the question. I'm really glad to hear you question this the idea of ethno-hearing, because of course it's so important, and what Mantle Hood said about bi-musicality, but at this point we're often talking about multi-musicalities, not only bi. And the one thing, I mean, I've been harping on, or an idea that I've been pushing for a long time, particularly teaching in Europe, but just in general, is the fact that we all have pluralistic identity. And many of you have heard me say this before, that when we started teaching in Germany in particular, but in Europe, was like, we have these varied identities. And this is where we have something to contribute as Americans and as North Americans, that we're more, and certainly those of us here, we're more, I think, more raised with the notion of many identities, that we come from all these different places. And you guys have heard me say it before, I'm both I'm Jewish, I'm American, I'm a man, I'm a Californian, I partly grew up in New England, I live in Scotland, I mean, blah, 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 blah. And, I like rock and roll as well as Yiddish, Yiddish unaccompanied folk songs. And I mean, the points about marginality and value from below, that, I mean, it's also great stuff. I mean, this is the thing that, I think that we encounter as Eden and East European Jews. I mean, there's so many levels of kind of competing marginalizations or nesting marginalizations, where, on the one hand, we're marginalized as Jews. On the other hand, we're often,
Exoticized.
What?
Exoticized.
Yeah. I mean, and then there's this sort of, are we mainly a middle class population in North America, in Europe, but then we're also, it's like there's this, even for middle class, there's the thing, or even upper class. I mean, the idea of Yiddish Ashiris is as Schnee in Mart, et cetera, and the questions of like Ashka normativity at the same time that we're experiencing, what do you mean Ashka normativity? We're like struggling to like keep our culture and language and et cetera alive. There's, again, fuzzy categories. And what else? Oh, love listening for, juxtaposed with listening to. That's so, that's of course crosses all kinds of boundaries. It also occurred to me, and this is partly because of where I live, but also my lifelong attunement to the natural world, or what we call the natural world, as if we're not part of it, is that listening as a human skill is very, very old. The idea, if we're living and not especially surviving in a non quote urban, civilized, et cetera environment, we need to be completely attuned to the sounds around us, to animals, to birds, the way other animals are. I mean, I observe, not only all kinds of creatures, in the wild here, as wild as this part of Scotland gets, but just our cats. I mean, any creatures that are dependent on, especially on sound, on listening, for survival and just for living, that I think there's a different, of course, I mean, you mentioned the stethoscope. That's a great example. Stethoscope, telegraph, etc. But it's interesting to me, this continuity of what we naturally and as animals listen for, and then what we, it's kind of the nature. I don't know, it gets into the nature culture things. Yeah, I don't know. And then I love the ideas of the modalities of Yiddish listening, the analytical and effective, and that we, again, the categories are, as I think, as you suggested, they're fuzzy. And finally, I guess the idea that, the experience in the world that we inhabit, the experience of teaching and listening to this stuff and discussing it is part of it's part of the creation and the living of this community and of the ethnos in that sense, or ethni. Maybe those are some thoughts I had.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's so yeah, I also wrote down a lot of notes now in response.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Great.
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
wonderful. Just
yeah, and you're totally right, of course, yeah, of this. I mean, and thank you for reminding me again of yeah, my initial, yeah, in a way I think I keep coming up also on my own bias as part of, you know, this of my generation of people interested in Yiddish song, and I'm sure there's a term for this, you know, this assumption, this bias of assuming everything is new and novel, and then kind of the fact that it isn't, and yeah. So I would also be really interested to hear, you know, also maybe your thoughts a bit on these questions of like the post vernacular, or how much to draw the line. I mean, I think it's so difficult to tread the line, because of course it's also not, you know, it's not honest, or maybe not even desirable to just to call it, you know, to pure continuity or a pure transmission process. But how to describe it in a way that also doesn't romanticize the before in a way that is kind of yeah, I mean, I think that's also the problem with the whole post vernacular, and the just the quote from Sandra that I showed, this in parentheses, as one presumably had once done, you know, like as if everything was just learned and natural. And actually I recently really came up with that also in another interview with Rosa Levitsky, who has such interesting thoughts on this question of post vernacularity, and on the fact that in the history of Yiddishism, I mean, how much the post vernacularity there already was in the history of like in the creation of modern Yiddish, and so she said something like, you know, should we call Dubnov a post vernacular now, or like Weinreich and something like that. So I think that these are really important things to think about, and at the same time there is a
Shalom
Aleichem,
Aleichem.
yeah. So how much is, you know, modern Yiddish literature, modern Yiddishism? I mean, and it always came from a multilingual. It never came from a you know, bounded. So how much are we also kind of, yeah, putting this ahistorical image of the you know, unitary homogeneous Yiddish speaking world on this, but how can we still speak about the change that is happening, that there is change that has happened or that is happening? Yeah,
right. I mean, the Chumash is post vernacular.
mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
Looking ahead, I'm wondering about a next step. The Yiddish Folksong project is now as easily available as the Ruth Rubin, but I think many of the people you've been talking to probably don't even know it's there yet,
Mm-hmm.
And don't know what it entailed and why it's important. And to me, what makes it different is not just that there are like a whole lot of songs that you may or not have heard before, which is true,
Mm-hmm.
but because you can't hear the songs without listening through the interview.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that to me is really a big difference, because Rubin is kind of a resource extraction device,
Mm-hmm.
right? You've got just the singers, and Ruth was not interested in the contextualization at all. I mean, she just would say that. Whereas this is all context, and the songs are kind of there as part of the flow, and because it was the main focus was, let's understand these people through their songs, but we're understanding the people, and they talk about their stories and so forth. Much as is the same case for the Fortuna, for the Spielberg tapes, where the songs are embedded in oral history. But in this case, it's really very much about songs, and the information around them is so dense. And you have to make an effort to listen or not listen to, or not be able to listen to the Yiddish of the interviews, which are often in Yiddish, but not always, since there's some English there too. But it's a different medium of listening, that those tapes than than the medium of listening that we've been dealing with right now, the recordings or these isolated archive recordings. So I think we ought to encourage. This is a whole discussion I had with Josh and with Barbara, whose project this is how we can get YIVO interested in promoting this, which they're not, and how we can get this out to the world in some other ways, so that other people that you were talking to will be forced to encounter it in some sense, and to reposition, in a sense, their understanding of even the unaccompanied song through the lived experience that the interviews offer.
Can I second the motion?
Right.
Yeah, I think you know, the same thought came to me because Mark and I had been talking about this collection at the which is now at the Evo, and becoming hopefully more and more accessible. I mean, it's online, but yeah, it's kind of a what they call in the legal world a data dump. It's like, you know, suddenly you have like 10,000 pages of stuff, and how are you going to get your hands around it?
The paper materials are different, but
Yeah,
the recordings are just there, and you can just.
the recordings are just there.
But they're in the library, right?
No, they're online.
They're online.
Yeah, but in the online library or
Yeah.
Listen
to all these things.
Yeah, because I've searched for, you know, I've been one of those people who's been trying to search for it, and I've heard some of the performances, and that people have been working with the repertoire, and I'm like, where can I listen to it? And I'm not finding it. So
it's pretty easy. I mean,
we'll send you a link.
Okay.
We'll send you a link when we finish
right.
our.
YIVO is not native. You're right.
Yeah, it's not just a a real super easy point and click interface, but yeah, you'll get there.
It should be, of course. But you know, well, Itzik and Ethel haven't chimed in, but I did want to follow up on 2 points. You know, I like very much your analogy with the stethoscope, learning to hear the heart. But I do want to point out, I think, what's an important difference as well. This will be obvious, I guess. I'm used to listening to Yiddish singers or any singers, and as Jane will tell you, I often will say, well, that singer is performative rather than communicative, right? And I value the communicative kind of singing. When listening to the heart through a stethoscope, I think it's important to acknowledge that, like much listening in the natural world, it's what I guess we could call symptomatic sound, because it's a symptom of something that's happening, and we can learn to interpret it, you know, and learn what to listen for to see, you know, which valve is that's making that sound. But it's not as if the heart is trying to communicate as it's doing that. It's a symptom of a process. And as Meshki points out, it could be very important for us to learn, you know, what the process is that's creating these sounds. But I contrast that with when I hear a song in a language I don't know, let's say Turkish. I'm pretty sure, and I remember a case where I was riding with someone in a car up in Montreal with Rivka Augenfeld, in fact, and we heard someone singing on the radio in a foreign language neither of us understood at all. But what was clear to us was that the singer was singing in their native language. that they were communicating, even though we didn't understand what they were communicating. So this experience that Sveta had of being at sea with not understanding is very different if you're listening to something which has no communicative aspect to it versus something which is merely symptomatic or performative. Um, and I just want to put a plug in for that as part of the listening thing. It's like, um, yeah, not all things that we are listening to um, are the same in that sense. And it's I think of the kind of listening that we value in terms of making a song tradition live is the kind where somehow storing the sounds in our minds in a format that will enable us to then reproduce it, not
Yeah.
not phonetically, not just
Yeah.
echo the sound, but reproduce it through our own system of musical language.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's I remember Itzik making a comment recently about um, a recording of people singing at a table or at a uh, gathering, and people sort of coming in with different bits and pieces and singing along at different voices. If I remember, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but you said something like, at first, it kind of bothered me that they were interrupting the performance, right? But then I realized that no, that's actually the way that we do it. That's how we learned it, and that's how it actually lives in our lives, and that we're always doing that. And I think we've all experienced that. We're sitting at a table, someone starts singing a song, and someone else either singt unter, which is a whole topic I love to get into, but um, yeah. So,
Josh,
um,
Yeah.
how would you define your performative and your communicative? I think those
so
are really they're huge, huge trunks, right? Uh,
yeah,
but just in general, and I think that it's, unless we actually mean things that we can all sort of understand, it won't be useful.
okay. This is tricky. I haven't really tried to make a formally cogent explanation of this, but I would say that if if I'm hearing someone sing, and my sense is that the focus of that activity on their part is, um, uh, I would say, more on the quality of the sound or the quality of the performance. Are they uh, uh, getting the rhythm right? Are they, something like that? Or how nice does their voice sound? That's on the end of the spectrum towards performative because it's uh, yeah, I don't know, as opposed to someone who is singing and they're either um, speaking through the song, they're actually, embodying it as a communication. Maybe we could put it, maybe I could give this example. If someone is singing a song in a language they don't understand, they could sing a beautiful aria, let's say. Um, and maybe they've learned it by listening to, great singers of the past or whatever, or with a great coach. But from beginning to end, they have no idea what they're singing. that would be the definition of a performative singing.
I think it might be useful here to use Goffman's concept of framing, because which we
Who's
never
that?
use quite enough.
Who's that?
Irving Goffman, who's a great sociologist, sociolinguist, talked about framing, that every interaction we have or every intention we have, we frame it. So in the frame of right now, I'm speaking in the frame of this, exercise we're doing, and I'm using my voice a certain way, and I'm using gestures a certain way, and I'm thinking about the timing of it because it's framed. So singers, the question is whether singers are consciously framing. This is now, I'm putting this in this particular frame, or the frame they're working from is a frame that it's just me here. Framing is helpful as a way of thinking about how people do construct events, when there are other people around. So that's a possibility. I would say, Josh, about the stethoscope, I think the point is that it's it's the beginnings of mediated listening. Before that, you didn't have devices that you listened through, really. You had to just use your ears. And so the things like the telegraph, and the point there is, it's like sound recording and what we do listening to sound recording. It's media. It's not the human being there or whatever, or it's not the actual, you're not hearing the heart unless you got a device on. Then I think that's part of the issue. And that's what you were complaining. You were about to complain.
Yeah, no. I'm thinking that this issue of performative and communicative is incredibly deep and incredibly important, and is sort of volleyed around loosely. And I think that it really demands much more thought and thinking about, and yeah, I mean, what comes to mind is Michael. Who's the guy who sang Waltzing Matilda?
Which one? The
one that you
Eric Bogle, who wrote it and sang it.
That would be wonderful to say, let's listen to that and evaluate what's going on there, because it would be impossible. So that when the line gets so close, is it really binary? So I just offer that as food for thought.
Sure.
I'm not claiming that it's a binary. I think that these are two aspects of, I mean, any singing is performing the song in that, in the sense that Mike Meshke was saying. But I think there's some sort of a balance which I perceive, at least subjectively, as being different in different cases. That's what I would say.
It's really not a challenge. I think that it's just something really interesting and profound for all of us to contemplate.
Yes, and I find it's also it's very significant in the whole kind of teaching and performing, learning, performing that's going on in our circles that we're talking about.
So I'm wondering how much does it, I mean, would a way, and with the way in which I understand it, and I remember you also talked about, we also talked about it in private, you also mentioned kind of performative and communicative. And I've also been thinking about it kind of in relation to Thomas Torino's distinction between performative, kind of performance music and participatory music, where the difference is more of a context question. And maybe how much is it, the context that that shapes the music and the style. I mean, the same also maybe coming down to questions of expression or intimacy in the music or something like that. How much does that just come from the context and cannot be put on stage or cannot be performed in this way? I don't know if that distinction fits with what you're thinking about between performative and communicative, or whether the communicative could fit within this idea of the participatory whether that is more useful. But I mean, that's also again, yeah.
Yeah, no, they're very, very, very fascinating and important things to think about, I think.
Mm.
You know,
Well, I think
Yeah.
all music is communicative. I mean, I used to in classes put on stuff that the students had no idea what it was. And I would say, okay, is this person serious? Is it, what is the intent behind this? And they would get me right all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
If and they got this through loudspeakers, in a space that had nothing to do with the original person. The time was different. It was not connected at all. And you put this on, they say, oh yes, this is possibly a ritual. I understand. They were able to do that without knowing the language. So I think human beings are communicative, and so that's the word is not a very useful, not a helpful word, because everything is communicative.
Maybe we can refine it, and then it would be easier to talk about. In other words, it's like, so there's XYZ out there singing a song, and it's off the mark. And one of the things we would say, it's off the mark because it's performative, and that's because of a poverty of language that we say that, right? And I just think that it would be good to sort of refine those ideas and those thoughts and the language and how we speak about it. That's really all I'm saying.
Yeah. Isabel.
Yeah, sorry. No, I just wanted to come back to one thing that you said in the beginning about this idea that the listening, the way it lives the most would be kind of in this way of listening in order to remember it. And I kind of, when I started to, I started a bit with trying to kind of sketch out what, trying to find a typology of what different modes of listening are there. And that's kind of how I came to this. In the end, I ended up scrapping most of them and thinking, okay, it's on some kind of continuum between this affective and the analytical. But one that fell out was what I kind of called it transmissive listening, but maybe that's not the right term. But it is this type of listening that I also find so fascinating to hear about, the hearing, hearing someone sing and remembering the song from maybe once or twice, hearing the person singing and being able to also, take over some of the interpretation, but also personalize it, but without even consciously doing it. And even just the fact of memorizing a song from hearing it, I mean, that's really something that is so different when listening to a recording where you have the option of listening to it over and over again. So I don't know if that makes sense to distinguish this type of or I thought of it also maybe as like an in situ form of listening or something like that it's like, it's in presence, and it requires very different skills. And
but that's the only way anybody could hear anything before now.
Right.
It's the only way you could
exactly.
You just forget that there was no possibility except listening so hard that you remembered your uncle saying that the day before he went off to the war and didn't come back, and you remember that, you have to have listened extremely intently. You wouldn't have remembered that thing. So, it's like you haven't said a word yet, right? And you're muted, right? You're even muted.
That you're muted, right?
So you're muted. It looks like you're muted.
I actually know very little, Isabel, about your biography. Did you sing before Yiddish? Did you? Are you a singer?
Yeah, I did sing. I mean, yeah, I always sang. I sang mostly like I did grow up with a lot of Jewish music, but mostly kind of synagogue, like reform, movement music, synagogue music, and Israeli folk songs. And I didn't have any Yiddish in my family at all. Yeah, so that's sorry, I didn't mention that. There's so much, but
I was
so definitely not a native listener.
Is there any comparative work, like did you listen to other field recordings before Yiddish? What?
Yeah, I guess not. I mean, did I? No, I never listened to field recordings, right? Yeah. I think that's also because I got into ethnomusicology through Yiddish singing first, and I did more like general anthropology before that. So that's a really good point, and I think that's another thing that, that encounters also, this is what I'm saying, like how much is it specific to Yiddish and how much is it just generally the fact that we don't, encounter field recordings all the time. They're something specialized and they are not distributed they're far apart from commercial music. So that's a great point. Yeah.
And also valuing Yiddish culture in general, and then more specifically the Yiddish song. You came right to the song, right? You came pretty much right to the Yiddish song rather than, I'm thinking of post-vernacular.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, in terms of my biography, I first came to Yiddish song before coming to Yiddish language or Yiddish literature. Yes.
Mm.
So I'm very much from my cultural background is very much one of kind of Austro-Hungarian assimilated anti-Yiddish. So that's also like part of the but I would say the Vienna Jewish community is mixed because they're also, there are also people from Yiddish speaking background, Polish Jewish background or something like that. But there's more this history of like anti-Yiddish. So maybe I also feel that stronger, from this very particular angle of like.
And I know you like to particularly perform more political Yiddish songs or more social songs, right?
Yeah. So I basically entered into Yiddish song through this political interest and through this political desire. I mean, that's how through this basically like rediscovering this also whole history of like left-wing Jewish culture and that was basically, these were my questions that led me to it, and that then opened the world wider. Yeah. And I think there are definitely other people from my generation that I know who have a similar story, but also very different, reasons. What is the hook that attracts people, that gets people? It can be very different, I think.
Can you give a few examples? I think that would be interesting of the other hooks that hook people into.
Oh, I think for that, maybe that's always I think that for a lot of people it is more biographical, like directly biographical, related to maybe their grandparents or or more from a kind of especially I guess in the this idea of kind of rediscovering one's direct roots. Or I don't know. I think it's often also the affinity to folk music in other ways that then brings. And I think one of you definitely has said that. He said that, I forgot who that also for a lot of people was kind of the anchor point through other folk musics and other traditional musics.
Definitely.
I think in a way it does make a difference also whether people are have Yiddish in their family background or are Jewish or not, but it's also it gets very fuzzy, because obviously the question of who, there are few people I think who really own, say like, oh, I own this. This doesn't exist in this way. I think these questions of kind of a cultural ownership or of like fixed identity that is much more fluid, I think, a lot of especially with Yiddish culture, and depending on the context. I keep thinking that the North American context is very different than in Europe, and in Europe again it's very different in different places. And so I think it's also important to I'm trying to understand more also how much of it is coming also from a particular American Jewish cultural history,
and a lot of it is generational, as you pointed out. Those who grew up with native speakers, European-born East European Jews, and the community that they grew up in, and the balance of languages and cultural input that they had. I mean, it's very profound. Those
Yeah.
different, yeah.
Yeah.
What would you, sorry, Ethel, did you want to say more?
No. Well, sure, but I don't need to say it here. I mean, there's just, no,
If not now, when? No, I was gonna say something, but I didn't. I interrupted you. In that case, no, I was. What, Isabel? What about your relationship with, say, the music on and singing and song on within the spectrum of Austrian or German language, traditional music, folk music, on into Liedermacher, on into singer-songwriters.
Yeah, interesting. I feel like there's
Hungarian too.
Yeah, there was no, I mean, yeah, I didn't grow up with any kind of Austrian traditional music ever. I mean, it's so foreign to me. And I think it's partly also a Vienna, like, it's partly part of kind of the imperial history of Vienna and part of a multi-nation empire versus the rest of Austria. But it's also definitely related to a kind of Jewish urban assimilate. It's it was always more kind of this like bourgeois assimilated Jewish culture, if anything, oriented towards kind of classical music, and not even. I mean, my grandparents spoke Hungarian, they speak Hungarian, and I don't think they ever, they have nothing to do also with Hungarian traditional music, but with more like Liedermacher and stuff like that, I think that for sure, yes. I mean, I for example, I don't know if you know like Georg Kreisler or like the chansonniers of like the early 20th century. A lot of them also Jewish, German language, like it's I think that much more, or this type of I guess more urban German language music.
But I think you ought to take advantage of your
Urban is a
university.
very crucial word there. I think of Theo and Bela.
Yeah, for example.
Very much so.
But I think you should take advantage of your university being a center of Austrian folk music research. They teach that. They do fieldwork, and I think that it will be interesting you to find out how people do that in traditions right around you to understand, say, something like Davini's Jewish milieu. And also the fieldwork, intense fieldwork that Ursula Hamatek and her crowd have been doing for decades with all the other communities in Vienna, where they go out and they, promote them and listen to them, and they have all revival movements. And, you have really a hotbed of very seriously done work there, on some of it being vernacular, some of it maybe being post-vernacular.
Yeah.
And I really wonder how the folk song, the actual Austrian folk song world operates within some of the parameters that we've been talking about. So I think
that's very interesting.
I mean, it's right there at your university.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And there are two good recordings of Austrian folk music on either Arhuli or Folk Lyric that Chris Strackwitz put out in the 70s. I mean, he did he himself, well, he actually Silesian German originally, but there are two LPs. I don't know if I imagine they're probably in the Arhuli or Folk Lyric catalog.
Folkways owns Arhuli now.
Yeah, right. And those are, he did two, I think they're 2 volumes of 2 LPs of Austrian traditional music, ranging from, traditional singers in the Alps to Viennese street music and so forth. Those are, the kind of, you might even find them on YouTube or something, but certainly via Arhuli. But yeah, there's so much there too.
Yeah.
Not that you have to go there, but it's just.
No, but it's really, and it reminds me of the fact that every time I do bring, when I do bring these also questions and also concepts to my supervisor, Ursula Hamatek, she's really been a pioneer kind of in the minority music studies. And she's often like, why is this, special? Why is this called post vernacular? That's like everywhere, that's what any kind of minority music, and or any kind of like folk music, in German, there's this term like Volksmusikpflege. So it's like the care of the music. But there again, I do think it's really a difference. I mean, also especially in Austria, where there's definitely, I definitely have an internalized kind of political aversion to traditional Austrian traditional music because of its instrumentalization through kind of especially also in Nazi times and stuff, and there still is kind of this and at the same time, I'm also, I also find it difficult to fit what is happening with Yiddish music exactly into this minority framework, because especially maybe that's also related to the fact that I don't know, it just doesn't get put together so often, and there's some kind of aversion of I think maybe placing oneself as a minority or kind of comparing oneself to other marginalized groups or but yeah, thank you, it's a great point. I'm and what I've also found interesting is kind of when I have also talked about it or also presented and talked about something like the post vernacular, a lot of people who are in ethnomusicology or folk music research are really interested in the concept and are like, oh, that makes so much sense in other. And I've heard that in terms of language, it has been used also for other languages like Irish or other situations of post vernacularity. I mean,
sure.
So I'm wondering like how much is it, a kind of universal like folk music phenomenon.
Absolutely, yeah. The Irish one is a good example too.
Well, we've been going almost
especially in
Isabel, let me squeeze in one more question. I know we're getting close to time here. In your own life and in your circle of acquaintances, do you, when or do you sing Yiddish songs?
Yeah, I mean, I also feel like that I'm missing the context where to perform, especially kind of sing. I mean, I sing a lot. I sing a lot to myself. I bike, and I sing a lot while biking and while cooking and while, like that.
That's a great answer.
But then when other people maybe want to hear me sing, then it is usually with, get your guitar and play us a song. And when I've tried to perform, it's always very tricky. Yeah. And it's and I don't know, I always feel like there's understanding lacking or so I guess also I feel like I feel like a context missing, but also I mean, I don't have a community of I have communities of other also Yiddish speakers or singers also in Vienna who I hang out with, but it's not like we get together and have Singerei, I guess, Yeah.
Thank you.
I think this has been a really fruitful
wonderful session.
Thank you,
very
Isabel.
collegial and very helpful for our projects. We
Great
want to thank you
presentation.
for putting all this.
Thank you so much.
To the presentation itself, and of course we're all ready to talk with you and as you go on with your work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I still, some of you who I haven't yet really kind of like spoken more in depth, I will contact you, and I would love to and talk to you again. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. It's really special, and yeah, so happy it's finding resonance, because it's really, I mean, this is, I'm basically just trying to sponge up everything and feed it back and make it put it into words in a way, or take words and put them together. But it really matters a lot what you think.
You have an incredibly receptive group.
That's good.
I want to underscore what I mean, Josh said, and I think what we're all saying too. You know, what you're doing is giving totally. I mean, I don't even mean to put it in terms of, you know, us and you, but necessarily. But I mean, you're giving back so much. I mean, that what you're doing is such important work in terms of putting this out there and and formalizing it and you know, creating a framework of understanding it. And
Especially this aspect of it. You know, no one really is talking about it.
Mm.
The whole concept of listening and hearing and transmission. I mean, I love the three words together.
Mm.
Mhm.
Good.
Okay, well, I guess I'll stop the recording now.
Yeah.